Now, when this social contract is established, it's not the case that it's established with, say, a magistrate or a mayor or something that rules. Rousseau is very insistent upon the point that originally in the social contract, individuals are equal. They are equal in the sense that they are all members of this social body. They are not equal in the sense that they have the same property. And that's really important because the whole point behind joining the civil society was for them to be able to protect their property. That means some have more, others have less. So they're not equal in terms of property, but they are equal in terms of, say, their political representations. They're all citizens. So it's not the case that there are going to be magistrates or kings originally. Again, this is part of the critique that Rousseau and Locke both have of paternal power or of monarchies. They think that monarchies are in fact secondary forms of civil society, much farther on. So they have some equality between one another, but most importantly, they have a law. They have laws, and probably the most important of all of those is the law that says that you cannot steal from another individual. So think for a second about one of those original civil compacts, namely the Decalogue, right? That's one of the important components of the Decalogue, along with, say, thou shalt not kill. For Rousseau, killing individuals is taking their life away from them, and their life is one of their forms of property. In fact, it's their primary form of property. So even the Decalogue, even the Ten Commandments, has protections for property, although those are established in that case by divine right? Because supposedly these 10 commandments were given to us by God. It's not going to be the case, however, that just because we have a social contract, this is going to solve all of our woes and there will be no need in the future for future forms of government. In fact, that's the whole reason why he says on page 65 that the same vices that make social institutions necessary are the same ones that make their abuses inevitable. He also says on page 65 in the paragraph right above that, so go and look at page 65, that there are different stages in inequality. So he says, we will find that the first stage was the establishment of law and of the right of property. That's what we already talked about, right? That was the original social contract. The second stage was the institution of the magistracy, or he even uses the word magistrature, but a magistrate, by which we mean like a judge. Why do we need a judge? Well, we have a problem in even civil society that if all of these individuals are politically equal, namely as citizens, then how do conflicts between individuals become resolved? And one of the ways that we try to solve that is by putting a judge in place, some sort of impartial being who is supposed to make decisions, who won't be, say, swayed by political forces, who won't be swayed by the power of one individual over another. And then, as we can see from our own contemporary society, that doesn't work very well in the end. And then Rousseau says that there is a third and a final stage, and this was the transformation of legitimate power into arbitrary power. And so what he means by that, I believe, is the creation of something like monarchical regimes. And the reason why that's arbitrary is because you have it's arbitrary in the sense that the divine right of kings is arbitrary. The reason why these specific people are going to be a ruling class over another group of people is based on some sort of myth. the divine right of kings, that there's a bloodline that goes back. We see this in the Old Testament, and we see this in the modern period, where we try to understand the succession of one monarch after another. Even though the reason why he says that this is a third or final stage is because he thinks that this is going to lead to another sort of eventual just collapse of civil society. At this point, it will be the kind of civil society that has arbitrary power, and he talks about this over on page, this is around page 68. So you'll see at the bottom of page 68, he says, the final stage of inequality and the extreme point that closes the circle and touches the point from which we started. Here, all private individuals become equal again because they are nothing. And since subjects no longer have any law other than the master's will, nor the master any rule other than his passions, the notions of good and the principles of justice again vanish. Here everything is returned solely to the law of the strongest, and consequently to a new state of nature. So this is a state of nature in the sense that civil society has disappeared, but it's not the state of nature that he describes in part 1 of the Discourse on Inequality. Is it just me, or is this going really, really well? From that last passage that I read to you, namely that reference to a circle, one draws the inference that he thinks that we are in a kind of almost, what's the word for it? A sort of vicious cycle. A vicious cycle in which we have certain characteristics as human beings, and these are the results of civil society. These in turn require civil society in order to somehow produce justice between individuals. But at the same time, these are going to lead to the collapse of those same institutions. And so I think that Rousseau would say that what you see across history after the original instantiation of civil society is creations, developments of civil societies, collapses of civil societies, recreations of civil society. It's a cycle that repeats itself over and over again. And there is no solution because there is no way yet in order to change human being. There's no way to make human being different from the way it is. This reminds me of a question that someone asked about Marx and whether or not Rousseau would be a Marxist. And the answer to that question, I think I said was no. The reason why I said that was because Rousseau does not think that we can go back in history and somehow reclaim that state of nature. That state of nature itself existed, eons ago, so hundreds of thousands of years ago. And the transformation of human being has been so complete that it's impossible to conceive us going back. That said, when people like Marx are writing, Marx, for example, is thinking about changing human nature itself. That's one of the kind of exciting, perhaps deceptive things about Marx, namely that he thinks that in different types of social regimes, you're going to have different types of people. And so he thinks that in a regime like socialism, where all the needs of the individual are provided for, each one will in turn not be concerned about having more than others. We could always look at more recent historical developments like this fall of the Soviet Union and talk about that. And that would be interesting, especially thinking about how the fall of the Soviet Union was followed by what we call a kleptocracy. right? Everybody more or less agrees that Russia is a kleptocracy. Everybody agrees. There is no one who disagrees with this. I just went to see this lecture a couple of nights ago by Timothy Snyder. He wrote a book called The Road to Unfreedom. And in that book, he's describing essentially the history of Russia, Poland, the Ukraine. Oops, sorry, I said the Ukraine, but apparently Ukrainians insist on Ukraine. I'm sure there's a really good reason for this, but I don't really know what it is, to be perfectly honest. And then, of course, the European Union. And one of the claims that Snyder is making is that Russia is a kleptocracy. And by that, what he means is that there is wealth that is concentrated in the hands of only a few number of people. And yeah, it's actually a really kind of bad situation. So I want to talk about two last things. I know your patience is perhaps running out, but take a breather, and maybe, I'm sure you're going to want to replay this over and over again, probably show your friends how cool your class is, or those two things are this. First, so what is he saying is wrong with civil society? He's saying that civil society has essentially defaced what human beings are. It's made them into, people that can't be happy. And that's what he means when he says that it is, he says that it's not right for slaves to reason about freedom. We have given up our freedom, and that's one of the things that he thinks is most dangerous about civil society. The other thing that I want to mention, because it pertains to the things that we've been talking about and the things that we're going to talk about, is this account of what slavery is. Some of you, when you wrote about The Tempest, were led to a conclusion that, actually only a couple of you, but which I think is necessary, namely that there is a state of war existing between Prospero and Caliban. And a state of war is actually probably a good way to talk about the institution of slavery. You have an institution that is maintained largely through some form of violence. In the United States, of course, that violence was authorized in part by the federal government, by state governments, even by, say, local traditions, as well as, of course, we don't want to forget about the profound effect that racism had, the development of racism that justified slavery. But it's interesting thing about what Rousseau is saying, because Rousseau thinks that we are slaves. I find this kind of peculiar on the one hand, because if he thinks that we are slaves, that almost leads you to start wondering if he can really appreciate properly how unjust the actual institution of slavery is. Like, do we need to be able to differentiate between slavery as an institution, as, say, it was practiced in the United States from its origins up until the Civil War, and then, through the Jim Crow laws there afterwards? Or do we need to distinguish that from the slavery that he thinks that people in civil society exist in? Slavery, namely, of being dependent upon others. Okay, I know that there are some questions that some of you have, and I wish I could answer them. I would encourage you to actually talk to your colleagues, talk to other people in class, and have a conversation about this. Have some coffee. Say, hey, how are you doing? And say, can you answer this question for me? So I'll leave it there, but of course there is one remaining issue, which is the second essay assignment. And you want to know something about it because it's supposed to be assigned And so I'm going to make another little video that's going to talk about it.